Even if you never read the Gospels, you've certainly seen famous paintings, artworks, or films depicting Jesus' life and final days. His trial, the crucifixion, his death, and ultimately his resurrection. It's one of the most well-known stories in the world. But have you ever stopped to think about what that story actually means? Is it something we must take literally, or is there something more to it? Could the narrative of the crucifixion and resurrection go back even further than the Gospels themselves? Maybe all the way to Plato's teachings? The story of Christ's passion and resurrection is the central tenet of the New Testament. For many Christians, it's the moment that defines their faith, since Jesus' death was God's own sacrifice to save humanity from sin. In other words, God gave up his own Son to redeem humankind. Much like how, in ancient times, people would sacrifice lambs as a ritual of purification. In fact, Gospel writers even hinted at this indirectly by placing the time of Jesus' death and resurrection around the Jewish holiday of Passover, when lambs were traditionally sacrificed. Similarly, Paul's letters, the earliest Christian writings that survived from the 1st century CE, repeatedly reference Jesus' death as a literal sacrifice. In 1 Corinthians 5:7, he even says, "Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." This, however, was already much debated in ancient times. If Jesus was truly divine, how could he descend to earth into a material body, and how could ever God allow him to die such a gruesome death? The Romans were especially skeptical. To them, the idea of worshipping someone who was crucified was absurd. But even among early Christians, there were doubts. One early Gnostic teacher, Basilides of Alexandria, went so far as to claim that Jesus wasn't actually the one who was crucified at all, that it was Simon of Cyrene, the man who carried his cross, who was executed in his place. The notion that myths carry deeper, symbolic meanings goes way back in history. As early as the 6th century BCE, Theagenes of Rhegium suggested that some Greek myths weren't meant to be taken literally, but as metaphors. Plato hinted at the same idea in his Phaedrus, and a few centuries later, Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher from the 1st century BCE, took it even further. He wrote entire works interpreting the Jewish scriptures allegorically, often borrowing ideas and language straight from Plato. The early church fathers, especially Origen, followed in Philo's footsteps. They often used Platonic philosophy to explain Jesus' death and resurrection, not just as an act of salvation, but as a metaphor for the soul's fall and its subsequent return to divine union or theosis. You might be wondering now, where does Plato fit into all this? How could these ancient Greek philosophical notions relate to the gospel story itself? Well, the influence of ancient Platonism on early Christianity is actually so well documented that at this point it's almost considered self-evident. Most philosophers, theologians, and historians of religion agree that there was at least some level of Platonic influence. And it's especially noticeable in the Gospel of John. One of the clearest examples comes right at the very beginning of John's Gospel, where the writer connects Christ with the Logos, the Greek philosophical concept that was central to Middle Platonism. Some scholars have also noticed that parts of Jesus' life seem to closely mirror those of Plato's teacher, Socrates, so much so that it's hard to believe it's just a coincidence. Both were revolutionary thinkers who challenged the norms of their time. Neither of them wrote down their own teachings. Instead, their ideas were preserved through their followers. Both gathered a circle of devoted disciples. Both were put on trial under false charges. And in the end, both accepted their deaths willingly. But let's get back to Origen now. If Jesus' death on the cross carries a deeper message, what is it exactly? What does the concept of theosis or henosis really mean? It is inextricably linked to Platonic dualism and his ontological hierarchy. Plato and his followers argued that beyond the ever-changing material realm of perpetual change and death, there must exist a higher realm, the world of eternal, immaterial ideas. You've probably heard of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. It's one of the most famous stories in philosophy, found in his Republic. In it, human beings are imagined as prisoners, trapped in a dark cave, chained in such a way that they can only see shadows cast on the wall by objects behind them. Those shadows are all they know, their version of reality. But once someone manages to escape and step out into the sunlight, they finally see the world as it truly is. Sounds familiar? Yeah, it's basically the story behind The Matrix and many other movies, and that's no coincidence. The idea is pretty easy for us to grasp today. Even people who aren't religious often believe that we have a soul, something immaterial that lives inside us and maybe leaves the body when we die. But philosophers have been arguing about this for thousands of years. How exactly can something material like the body connect to something non-material like the soul? Why would a divine being even send souls into the physical world if it's supposed to be so inferior? To make sense of this, Plato's followers, especially the philosopher Plotinus, worked hard on the problem and organized the world into a special ontological hierarchy. Think of it as a pyramid with multiple levels of existence. At the very top is the One, the ultimate source of everything, so perfect that it's beyond comprehension. The One, however, overflows like water in a fountain, and thus creates the intellect or the spirit. That in turn overflows again and creates the soul, and this world soul is where human souls originate. Human souls, according to this view, descend from the One down into physical bodies, becoming trapped in the world of matter in a way. But through philosophy, spiritual practice, or divine inspiration, they can learn to rise back up, to return to the realm of eternal truth and unity. Not all Platonists agreed on the details, though. Some saw the physical world as evil or corrupt, the opposite of life. Others thought it wasn't evil at all, just a natural extension of the One. In any case, they all agreed that the soul's true home isn't here. It's beyond. Origen, who was deeply familiar with this philosophical tradition, noticed parallels between Plato's idea of the soul's journey and the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, both describing a kind of descent from and return to divine perfection. Interestingly, even the language used in some passages of Plato's dialogues is eerily reminiscent of the Crucifixion, even though they were written hundreds of years before these events supposedly took place. For example, following Origen, Justin Martyr examined what he called Plato's doctrine on the cross, although still accepting the Bible's primacy. He points to a passage in Plato's Timaeus, in which the philosopher argues that the world soul is impressed upon the physical universe in the form of a cross, or more precisely, the Greek letter chi. Another interesting parallel between the Timaeus and the Gospel narrative is the fact that Jesus' father Joseph was a carpenter or builder, tekton, and the god figure of the Timaeus creating the world is called a demiurgos by Plato, which also translates as craftsman or a builder. This parallel is somewhat vague, but you get the idea. What's more important, in addition to the above, we can find another relevant passage in a different dialogue in the Phaedo, which is largely overlooked. We have already touched upon the famous Allegory of the Cave, where we unfortunate earthly humans are tied up. Later in the text, Plato explains that this image represents souls tied up by their passions, and how they need to get rid of this bondage to their physical bodies to set themselves free. Now, in the Phaedo, Plato talks about the soul's relationship to the body in a similar fashion, but interestingly, the image is somewhat modified. Here, the soul is not bound, but nailed to the body by its passions. He says, because each pleasure and pain is a sort of nail, halon, which nails and rivets the soul to the body. This image, again, is strikingly similar to the crucifixion, so much so that it raises a fascinating question. Did this passage somehow influence the Gospel writers? Or was it the other way around? Did later Christians insert this into Plato's work to give it a more Christian flavor, so to speak? At first, I leaned toward the second idea, so I decided to take a look. I checked the oldest available manuscript of Plato's Phaedo, the Codex Clarkianus, from the 9th century CE. But I didn't see any signs of instability there. This doesn't mean, of course, that nobody added anything to the text at some point, but if they actually did, it must have happened much earlier in the text transmission. One argument that supports the theory of later addition is that the image of the soul being nailed to the body is quite unique to this specific Plato dialogue. At other times, the philosopher describes the soul's attachment to the body more in terms of bondage and imprisonment. However, it's also true that other Platonic philosophers like Philo of Alexandria occasionally use the same imagery of the nails. So based on this, it's quite unlikely that later Christian scribes would have added this to Plato's dialogue. But then I looked into the other idea as well. Were Paul or the Gospel writers influenced by this Platonic image? As I dug deeper into this, I noticed something surprising. None of the Gospel writers, or Paul for that matter, actually mention nails when describing Jesus' crucifixion. They all use the Greek word stauro, which simply means to crucify. But they don't go into details about how it was done. And see, this is a problem because historically, Roman crucifixion methods varied quite a lot. The shape of the cross wasn't standardized, and they didn't always nail people to it either. Interestingly, the only gospel that specifically uses the Greek word for nail that Plato also used in the Phaedo, halon, is the Gospel of John. And even in this book, it's not mentioned in the crucifixion scene itself, but later on in that famous moment when Jesus appears to doubting Thomas to show his wounds from the nails. Yet, it cannot be a simple coincidence that we see this parallel in this gospel, the one that's widely considered to be the most influenced by Platonic thought. So based on the evidence, it seems likely that Origen was absolutely right. When we read the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, we are not just reading history, we are reading the Christian version of the famous Platonic myth. It's a story about the soul descending into the material body, then being saved and descending back to the heavenly realm of Plato's eternal forms. Those thinking about the crucifixion merely as a literal event are therefore missing an important point. The message here is really Platonic. As souls trapped in material bodies, we are destined to suffer and die in a world of reflections and shadows. But we shouldn't fear. Beyond the body and its desires lies freedom, in the world of immaterial eternity. And this is the good news. And what do you think? Do you agree that Platonism influenced early Christian thought? Have you found any other interesting parallels in biblical texts? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much for watching this video, and see you in the next one.